My room wasn't empty. I left when my sister pulled me and whispered, "There's someone in your bed," during the night. I thought I knew what fear was until that Tuesday night in October changed everything I believed about safety, trust, and the people we think we can depend on. What happened in my bedroom that night wasn't just a break-in. It was the beginning of a nightmare that would strip away every assumption I had about my life, my marriage, and the man I had shared a bed with for 12 years. The day started like any other in our quiet suburban neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. The maple trees outside my window were dressed in their autumn colors, and the morning air carried that crisp promise of winter that always made me feel hopeful. I had just turned 42 the month before, and despite the challenges that come with middle age, I felt like I was finally finding my footing again, after years of feeling lost in my own life. My sister Rachel had been staying with us for 3 weeks, while she figured out her next move after a messy divorce. At 38, she was struggling to rebuild her confidence and find her independence again. Having her there felt natural, like we were teenagers again, sharing secrets and supporting each other through life's complications. Our childhood home in Cleveland had always been filled with whispered conversations after lights out, and now, decades later, we found ourselves falling back into those same patterns of sisterly protection and midnight confessions. The house we lived in was a modest 2-story colonial built in the 1970s, with creaky hardwood floors and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. My husband Mark had bought it 5 years before we married, and while it had its charm, it also had its quirks. The bedroom door never quite closed properly unless you gave it an extra push, and the heating system made strange clicking sounds throughout the night that we had all grown accustomed to ignoring. That particular Tuesday, Mark had been working late again at the accounting firm, where he had been a partner for the past 8 years. His absence had become more frequent over the last few months, something I attributed to the busy season and the stress of managing new clients. When he texted me around 9:30 that evening, saying he would be sleeping at the office again, I felt a familiar pang of loneliness, but pushed it aside. Rachel and I ordered Chinese takeout and spent the evening watching old movies on the couch, sharing stories about our teenage years, and laughing until our sides hurt. Around 11:15, I decided to head upstairs to bed. Rachel was still engrossed in a late-night talk show, curled up under the throw blanket our grandmother had crocheted years ago. The routine felt comforting and normal. I brushed my teeth, changed into my favorite cotton pajamas, and climbed into bed with a book I had been trying to finish for weeks. The bedroom felt spacious and peaceful with just me in it, and I remember thinking how nice it was to spread out across the entire mattress without worrying about disturbing anyone. I must have fallen asleep sometime after midnight, because the next thing I remember was Rachel's hand on my shoulder, shaking me gently but urgently. The room was completely dark except for the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. My first thought was that something was wrong with her, that maybe she was having another anxiety attack, like the ones that had been plaguing her since the divorce proceedings began. But when I opened my eyes and saw her face, I knew immediately that this was something different. Her expression held a terror I had never seen before, not even during the worst moments of her marriage falling apart. Her eyes were wide and focused on something behind me, and her hand was trembling against my shoulder. That is when she leaned down close to my ear and whispered the words that would change everything. Her voice was barely audible, but each word hit me like a physical blow. There was someone in my bed, someone who was not supposed to be there, someone who had somehow entered my home, my private sanctuary, and positioned themselves next to me while I slept. The immediate shock was followed by a wave of disbelief, so strong that my first instinct was to think Rachel was mistaken. Maybe she was seeing shadows or experiencing some kind of episode brought on by the stress she had been under. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I became more aware of my surroundings, I began to notice things that confirmed her terrifying observation. There was additional weight on the mattress that had not been there when I fell asleep. The covers on Mark's side of the bed were disturbed in a way that suggested someone had been lying there. Most unsettling of all, there was a warmth and presence next to me that felt foreign and wrong. This was not the familiar comfort of my husband's body heat, but something else entirely. Something that made every instinct I possessed scream that I was in immediate danger. My heart started pounding so hard I was afraid the sound might wake whoever was lying next to me. The rational part of my mind tried to process what was happening, but fear was overriding logic. How had someone gotten into the house? All the doors were locked, and I had checked them myself before going upstairs. The windows were secure, and we lived in a neighborhood where break-ins were virtually unheard of. Yet here I was, trapped in my own bed with an intruder who had somehow breached every barrier I thought protected me. Rachel's grip on my shoulder tightened, and I could see her gesturing toward the hallway. She wanted me to get out of the bed and leave the room immediately, but moving felt impossible. What if the person next to me was awake? What if any movement would trigger violence? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was this person armed? Had they been watching me sleep? How long had they been there? The house around us seemed to hold its breath. Those familiar, settling sounds that I usually found comforting now felt ominous and threatening. Every creak of the old wood floors could be another intruder moving through our home. Every whisper of wind against the windows could be masking the sound of someone else entering. The safety I had always felt within these walls had been completely shattered in a matter of seconds. I tried to control my breathing and think clearly about what to do next. My phone was on the nightstand, but reaching for it would require movement that might alert the intruder to the fact that I was awake. The bedroom door was only a few feet away, but getting there would mean sliding out of bed and potentially disturbing whoever was lying next to me. Every option seemed fraught with danger. Rachel seemed to understand my paralysis, because she began making subtle gestures toward the hallway, trying to communicate a plan without making any sound. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her eyes were focused and determined. Despite her own fear, she was trying to help me find a way out of this impossible situation. The bond between sisters that had sustained us through childhood nightmares was now being tested by a very real adult terror. As I lay there trying to decide what to do, I became hyper-aware of every sensation. The cotton sheets felt scratchy against my skin. The pillow beneath my head seemed too soft, as if it might swallow me up. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe normally. Even the familiar scent of the lavender fabric softener I always used seemed different somehow, contaminated by the presence of this unwelcome stranger. The person next to me shifted slightly, and my entire body went rigid with terror. The movement was small, just a subtle adjustment of position, but it confirmed that this was not a dream or a mistake. There was definitely someone in my bed, someone who had no right to be there, someone whose intentions I could not begin to guess. The reality of my vulnerability hit me with full force. I was wearing thin pajamas, I had no weapon, and I was trapped in a confined space with an unknown threat. Rachel's whispered words echoed in my mind as I tried to process the full implications of what was happening. This was not just a random break-in. Someone had specifically chosen to enter my bedroom and position themselves next to me while I slept. The intimacy of that violation felt almost worse than the physical danger. My bed had always been my refuge, the place where I felt most secure and protected. Now it had become a trap. The minutes stretched on endlessly as I tried to gather the courage to move. My muscles felt frozen, as if fear had turned my body to stone, but I knew I could not stay there forever. Eventually, the person next to me would wake up, or morning would come, and I would be forced to confront whatever this was. The longer I waited, the more dangerous the situation might become. Finally, Rachel made the decision for both of us. She reached across me slowly and carefully, her movements so gradual they were almost imperceptible. Her goal was my phone, and after what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, she managed to grasp it without making any noise. She held it up and showed me the screen, her finger poised over the emergency call button. The sight of those 3 digits, 911, brought a small measure of comfort. At least help was possible, even if it felt impossibly far away. But as she prepared to make the call, something happened that changed everything we thought we understood about the situation. The person in the bed next to me spoke, and the voice that emerged from the darkness was not that of a stranger at all. It was familiar in a way that made my blood run cold and my mind struggle to accept what I was hearing. The voice belonged to someone I knew, someone I trusted, someone who had every right to be in my house, but absolutely no right to be behaving this way. As the words registered in my consciousness, I realized that the nightmare I thought I was living was actually something far more complex and devastating than a simple break-in. This was a betrayal that cut to the very core of everything I believed about my life and the people in it. The revelation that followed would force me to question not just my safety, but my sanity, my judgment, and my ability to trust my own perceptions. What I discovered in those next few moments would unravel 12 years of marriage and expose secrets that had been hiding in plain sight. The intruder in my bed was not a stranger at all, but someone whose presence there represented a violation so profound that it would take me months to fully understand its implications. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, I realized that this night was not the beginning of my nightmare, but rather the moment when I finally woke up from a dream I had been living for years. The life I thought I had, the marriage I thought I understood, the safety I thought I could count on. All of it was about to crumble around me in ways I never could have imagined. Rachel's grip on my shoulder tightened as we both processed what we had just heard, and I knew that our lives were about to change forever. The person in my bed began to stir more actively, and I realized that whatever was about to happen next would determine not just my immediate safety, but the entire trajectory of my future. The comfortable suburban existence I had built over the past decade was about to be exposed as something far more fragile and illusory than I had ever understood. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen as I prepared to confront the truth about the intruder in my bed, knowing that whatever I learned would shatter the foundations of everything I had believed about love, trust, and the people we choose to build our lives around. The voice spoke again, clearer this time, and my heart nearly stopped beating altogether. It was Mark. My husband of 12 years was lying in our bed, but something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. He was supposed to be at the office, sleeping on the uncomfortable couch in his private suite as he had done so many times before during busy periods. Yet here he was, in our bedroom, in our bed, behaving in a way that felt completely alien and threatening. But as my eyes adjusted further to the darkness, and my mind began to process what I was actually seeing, I realized that the situation was even more disturbing than I had initially understood. Mark was not alone. There was another person in the bed with him, someone whose silhouette I could barely make out in the dim light filtering through the curtains. The additional weight I had felt on the mattress was not just from Mark, but from this second person who had no business being in my home, let alone in my bed. Rachel's breathing became shallow and rapid next to me, and I could feel her entire body trembling with a combination of fear and outrage. She had seen what I was seeing, and the implications were hitting both of us simultaneously. This was not a break-in or a case of mistaken identity. This was something far more personal and devastating. My husband had brought someone else into our marital bed, into our home, while I slept just feet away, completely unaware of the betrayal happening right next to me. The person with Mark shifted position, and I caught a glimpse of long hair and a feminine figure. My stomach dropped as I realized that Mark was in bed with another woman, in our bed, in our house, while I had been sleeping peacefully beside them. The violation felt so profound that I struggled to breathe. This was not just adultery. This was a level of disrespect and cruelty that I could never have imagined my husband capable of. The woman whispered something to Mark that I could not quite make out, but her tone was intimate and familiar. This was clearly not a one-time encounter or a moment of weakness. The comfort level between them suggested a relationship that had been developing over time, a connection that had grown strong enough for Mark to feel confident bringing her into our home and our bed while I slept nearby. My mind raced back through the past few months, searching for signs I might have missed. Mark's increased work hours suddenly took on a different meaning. The nights he claimed to be sleeping at the office, the weekend business trips that seemed to be happening more frequently, the way he had become distant and distracted during our conversations. All of it now painted a picture of a man living a double life with masterful deception. Rachel's hand found mine under the covers, and she squeezed it gently, trying to provide what comfort she could in this impossible situation. Her presence was the only thing keeping me grounded as my world collapsed around me. Without her, there to witness this betrayal, I might have convinced myself later that it was all a nightmare or a misunderstanding. But she was seeing everything I was seeing, validating the reality of this devastating discovery. The woman in the bed with Mark moved again, and this time I heard her speak more clearly. Her voice was younger than mine, with a slight accent that I could not immediately place. She was asking Mark about something related to work, which made me wonder if this was someone from his office, perhaps one of the new associates he had mentioned hiring recently. The professional connection would have given them plenty of opportunities to develop their relationship without arousing suspicion. As I lay there paralyzed by shock and betrayal, I began to understand that this moment was not just about discovering my husband's infidelity. It was about recognizing that the man I had trusted with my heart, my future, and my financial security had been systematically deceiving me for months, possibly years. The life we had built together, the plans we had made, the intimacy we had shared, all of it had been built on lies. The physical proximity of the betrayal made it even more traumatic. This was not something happening in a hotel room across town, or in some anonymous location I could distance myself from mentally. This was happening in my bed, between sheets I had washed and changed, in a room I had decorated and considered my sanctuary. Mark had contaminated our most private space with his deception, turning our bedroom into a crime scene of broken trust. I thought about all the mornings I had woken up in this same bed, reaching for Mark and finding him gone, assuming he had left early for work. How many of those mornings had he actually spent the night with someone else before returning home to maintain the facade of our marriage? How many times had I been sleeping in a bed that had been violated by his infidelity just hours before? The woman spoke again, and this time I caught enough words to understand that she was talking about leaving soon. Apparently, this was not an all-night affair, but rather a carefully orchestrated encounter timed to avoid detection. The calculated nature of their behavior made the betrayal even more painful. This was not a crime of passion, or a moment of weakness. This was premeditated deception carried out with precision and forethought. Rachel began to pull gently on my arm, indicating that we should leave the room before Mark and his companion realized we were awake. The logical part of my mind agreed that confronting them immediately might not be the safest or smartest approach. I needed time to process what I had discovered and to decide how to handle this situation in a way that would protect my interests and my dignity. But another part of me wanted to turn on the lights and force an immediate reckoning. I wanted to see the look on Mark's face when he realized he had been caught. I wanted to know who this woman was and how long this had been going on. I wanted answers to the thousands of questions that were flooding my mind. The urge for immediate confrontation was almost overwhelming. However, Rachel's wisdom prevailed. She continued to guide me toward the edge of the bed, helping me move slowly and silently away from the scene of betrayal. Each inch we moved felt like a victory and a defeat simultaneously. We were escaping the immediate danger of discovery, but we were also leaving behind the opportunity to catch them in the act and demand explanations. As we reached the edge of the bed, I realized that my entire body was shaking uncontrollably. The adrenaline of fear had been replaced by the adrenaline of rage and heartbreak, but the physical response was just as intense. Rachel helped steady me as we prepared to slip out of the room undetected. Her support was the only thing preventing me from collapsing under the weight of this revelation. The hardwood floor felt cold against my bare feet as I finally stood up next to the bed. The familiar sensation seemed foreign now, as if everything in my environment had been altered by what I had discovered. The room that had been my refuge for years now felt like enemy territory, contaminated by lies and betrayal. Mark and the woman continued their whispered conversation, apparently unaware that their secret had been exposed. Their obliviousness to my presence added another layer of insult to the injury. They felt so secure in their deception that they had grown careless, bringing their affair into my home and my bed without considering the possibility of being caught. As Rachel and I made our way toward the bedroom door, I took one last look at the bed where my marriage had just died. The two figures lying there represented the end of everything I had believed about my life and my future. 12 years of shared experiences, challenges overcome together, and dreams built as a partnership had been reduced to nothing more than an elaborate lie. The door handle felt cold in my hand as I turned it slowly, praying that the old hinges would not creak and give away our escape. Rachel was right behind me, her presence a constant reminder that I was not facing this nightmare alone. Whatever came next, I would have at least one person in my corner who had witnessed the truth of what Mark had done. We made it into the hallway without detection, but I knew that this was only the beginning of the most difficult period of my life. The discovery of Mark's betrayal would require me to rebuild everything from scratch. My understanding of my marriage, my financial security, my living situation, and my ability to trust another person with my heart. As we stood in the dark hallway outside my bedroom, listening to the continued whispers of my husband and his lover, I realized that the woman who had gone to sleep peacefully just hours earlier no longer existed. She had been replaced by someone who would have to be stronger, smarter, and more independent than I had ever imagined possible. The journey ahead would be painful and challenging, but at least now I knew the truth about the man I had been sharing my life with. Rachel guided me down the hallway toward the guest room where she had been staying, her hand never leaving my arm. Each step felt surreal, as if I was walking through someone else's nightmare rather than my own life. The familiar photographs lining the hallway walls seemed to mock me now. Images of Mark and me at various stages of our relationship, smiling and embracing, completely unaware of the deception that would eventually destroy everything we appeared to represent. Once we reached the safety of Rachel's room, she closed the door behind us and immediately pulled me into her arms. The dam of emotion that I had been holding back finally burst, and I began to sob with the intensity that scared both of us. The grief was physical, a pain that seemed to emanate from the very center of my being and radiate outward until every part of my body ached with the weight of betrayal. Rachel held me while I cried, stroking my hair and whispering reassurances that felt both comforting and hollow. What comfort could there be in discovering that your entire adult life had been built on lies? What reassurance could possibly address the fact that the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically deceiving you for months or possibly years? When the initial wave of tears subsided, I found myself overwhelmed by practical concerns that seemed almost absurd in the context of such emotional devastation. What would happen to our house? Our joint bank accounts? The vacation we had planned for next month? The dinner party we were supposed to host for Mark's colleagues next weekend? How do you untangle 12 years of intertwined lives when half of the partnership has been living a lie? Rachel seemed to understand the direction of my thoughts, because she began speaking in practical terms about immediate steps I would need to take. Document everything. Contact a lawyer. Secure my financial accounts. Change passwords. The list felt overwhelming, but her methodical approach provided a lifeline of concrete actions I could take when everything else felt impossibly abstract and emotional. We could still hear muffled voices from the bedroom down the hall, and I realized with growing horror that Mark and his companion were apparently in no hurry to end their encounter. The audacity of bringing another woman into our home, into our bed, while I slept nearby was staggering. It suggested a level of contempt for me and our marriage that I would never have believed possible from the man I had pledged my life to. As we sat on Rachel's bed in the darkness, she began asking gentle questions about things she had observed over the past few weeks of staying with us. Had I noticed Mark's increased absences? His changed behavior? His lack of interest in physical intimacy? Looking back through the lens of what I now knew, dozens of small details that I had dismissed or rationalized suddenly formed a clear pattern of deception. The business trips that had seemed excessive but legitimate now appeared suspicious. The new clothes that Mark claimed were necessary for client meetings now seemed like efforts to impress someone specific. The way he had become protective of his phone and computer now revealed itself as obvious signs of an affair that I had been too trusting to recognize. I thought about conversations we had had recently where Mark had seemed distracted or disinterested, times when I had tried to discuss our future plans and he had deflected or changed the subject, moments when I had attempted to initiate physical intimacy and he had claimed to be too tired or stressed from work. All of these interactions now took on new meaning, painting a picture of a man who had already emotionally and physically checked out of our marriage while maintaining the facade of commitment. The woman's voice drifted down the hallway again, and this time I heard her laugh softly at something Mark had said. The sound was like a knife twisting in my chest. This was not just physical betrayal. It was emotional intimacy that Mark had been sharing with someone else while pretending to share it with me. The laughter suggested comfort, familiarity, and genuine affection, all things that had been missing from my interactions with my husband for months. Rachel reached for her phone and suggested that we might want to document what was happening. The idea felt both practical and violating at the same time. On one hand, having evidence of Mark's infidelity would certainly be helpful in any legal proceedings that might follow. On the other hand, the thought of creating permanent records of this devastating night felt like I would be participating in my own humiliation. Before I could decide what to do about documentation, we heard movement from the bedroom, footsteps on the hardwood floor, the soft sound of clothing being gathered, whispered goodbyes. It appeared that their encounter was finally coming to an end. My heart began racing again as I realized that Mark would soon discover that his secret had been exposed, assuming he checked on my whereabouts before the other woman left. Rachel and I sat in tense silence, listening to the sounds of departure. We heard the bedroom door open more fully, followed by careful footsteps moving down the hallway toward the stairs. The woman was leaving, and Mark was apparently escorting her out of the house. The mundane nature of their departure, as if this was a routine they had performed many times before, made the betrayal feel even more calculated and cruel. Several minutes passed before we heard Mark's footsteps returning up the stairs. I held my breath, wondering if he would check the bedroom to see if I was still sleeping peacefully, oblivious to what had just occurred. The footsteps paused outside what I assumed was our bedroom door, and I imagined him looking at the empty bed where I should have been sleeping. Then we heard his footsteps moving more quickly, and I knew he had realized that I was not where I was supposed to be. The house suddenly felt charged with tension as Mark presumably began searching for me, trying to determine whether his affair had been discovered or if there was some innocent explanation for my absence from our bed. A soft knock on Rachel's door confirmed our fears. Mark's voice, trying to sound casual but clearly strained, called out asking if everything was okay. He claimed he had come home early from the office and found our bedroom empty, expressing concern about where I might be. The lies flowed so smoothly from his lips that I wondered how many times he had practiced deception until it became second nature. Rachel looked at me questioningly, waiting for direction on how to respond. We both knew that this moment would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. I could pretend to be asleep and try to maintain the facade for a little longer while I figured out my next steps. Or I could confront him immediately and force a reckoning that I was not sure I was emotionally prepared for. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Mark's voice carried a note of anxiety that suggested he was beginning to suspect that his carefully constructed double life might be unraveling. He asked Rachel directly if she had seen me, claiming that he was worried something might have happened to me. The concern in his voice might have been touching if I had not just witnessed him betraying our marriage vows in the most intimate way possible. I made the decision to remain silent, at least for now. Rachel called out softly that I was with her, that I had not been feeling well and had come to her room for comfort. It was not entirely a lie. I was certainly not feeling well, though not in the way Mark would assume. The excuse bought us time to think and plan without forcing an immediate confrontation. Mark's response revealed more than he probably intended. Instead of offering to help or expressing further concern about my health, he seemed relieved to have an explanation for my absence that did not threaten his secret. He told Rachel to let him know if I needed anything, and retreated to what I assumed was our bedroom. The ease with which he accepted the explanation suggested that his primary concern was protecting his affair, rather than caring for his supposedly ill wife. As his footsteps faded down the hallway, I realized that I was seeing Mark's true character for the first time in our 12 years together. The man I had married, the person I thought I knew better than anyone else in the world, was capable of levels of deception and selfishness that I never could have imagined. The loving husband persona had been exactly that, a performance designed to maintain his comfortable life while he pursued other interests. Rachel and I spent the rest of the night talking in whispers about what I should do next. She had been through her own divorce just months earlier and had hard-won wisdom about the legal and emotional challenges that lay ahead. Her experience became a roadmap for the steps I would need to take to protect myself and begin the process of rebuilding my life. As dawn approached, and the first hints of sunlight began filtering through Rachel's bedroom window, I felt a strange sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the chaos of emotion. The worst had happened. The marriage I had believed in was over, destroyed by betrayal so profound that there could be no recovery. But I was still here, still breathing, still capable of making decisions and taking action. The woman who had discovered her husband's affair in the most devastating way possible was not the same woman who would face him in the light of day. Overnight, I had been transformed from a trusting wife into someone who would need to be strategic, self-protective, and ruthlessly honest about the reality of her situation. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was seeing my life clearly, rather than through the fog of deception that Mark had created. The next morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Sunlight streamed through Rachel's bedroom windows, birds chirped in the oak tree outside, and the smell of coffee drifted up from the kitchen, where Mark was apparently maintaining his routine as if nothing had happened. The contrast between the ordinary sounds of suburban morning and the devastation I felt inside was almost surreal. I had not slept at all after witnessing Mark's betrayal, but somehow I felt more alert and focused than I had in months. The fog of confusion that had been clouding my judgment for so long had lifted completely. Every interaction with Mark over the past year suddenly made perfect sense when viewed through the lens of his deception. The distance, the lies, the lack of intimacy. It had all been part of his strategy to maintain his double life while keeping me as an unknowing participant in the charade. Rachel helped me prepare for what would inevitably be the most difficult conversation of my marriage. We discussed strategies for staying calm, documenting his admissions, and protecting myself legally. Her experience with her own divorce proceedings provided invaluable insight into the importance of gathering evidence and maintaining detailed records of everything that happened from this point forward. Before going downstairs to face Mark, I took a long look at myself in Rachel's bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than she had just 24 hours earlier, but there was also a new strength in her eyes that had not been there before. The naive trust that had made me vulnerable to Mark's deception had been replaced by a steely determination to reclaim control of my life and my future. I chose my clothes carefully, selecting a professional outfit that made me feel confident and authoritative. If I was going to confront my cheating husband, I wanted to do it from a position of strength, rather than appearing as a victim. The navy blue blazer and matching pants were armor for the battle I was about to fight for my dignity and my financial security. When I finally made my way downstairs, Mark was sitting at our kitchen table reading news on his tablet while drinking coffee from the mug I had given him for his birthday 2 years earlier. The domesticity of the scene felt like mockery after what I had witnessed just hours before. He looked up when I entered the room, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face as he tried to gauge whether I suspected anything. His greeting was overly cheerful, the kind of forced enthusiasm that people use when they are trying to overcompensate for guilty feelings. He asked about my health, referencing the excuse Rachel had given him the night before, and offered to make me breakfast. The solicitous behavior was so different from his usual morning routine that it only confirmed my certainty about what I had witnessed. I accepted his offer of coffee, using the few minutes while he prepared it to study his face and body language for signs of the deception I now knew he was capable of. Everything about his demeanor screamed guilt to me, from the way he avoided making direct eye contact to the nervous energy in his movements. How had I missed these obvious tells for so long? When he handed me the coffee mug, our fingers brushed briefly, and I felt nothing. The small spark of connection that had always existed between us, even during difficult periods in our marriage, had been completely extinguished by his betrayal. I was looking at a stranger who happened to share my last name and my mortgage payments. Mark began talking about his plans for the day, mentioning meetings with clients and paperwork that needed to be completed. Every word felt like another lie, another piece of the elaborate fiction he had constructed to hide his affair. I found myself wondering if any of his work commitments were real, or if they were all excuses to spend time with the woman he had brought into our bed. The casual way he discussed his schedule while sitting across from me at the same table, where we had shared thousands of meals over the years, felt like the ultimate insult. He was so confident in his ability to deceive me that he was not even bothering to be careful with his lies anymore. The hubris was staggering. I let him talk while I sipped my coffee and planned my approach. Part of me wanted to unleash all of my rage immediately, to scream and throw things and make him feel as devastated as I felt. But Rachel's advice echoed in my mind, reminding me that emotional outbursts would only give Mark ammunition to use against me later. I needed to be strategic, not reactive. When Mark finished outlining his fictitious day and asked about my own plans, I saw my opening. I told him calmly that I had been thinking about our relationship lately and felt like we needed to have an honest conversation about where we stood as a couple. The words were carefully chosen to sound like a routine marital check-in rather than an accusation. His reaction was immediate and telling. The color drained from his face, and he began fidgeting with his coffee mug in a way that revealed his anxiety. He asked what I meant, trying to sound casual but failing completely. The guilt was written all over his features, and I realized that he had been expecting this confrontation for some time. I continued in the same calm tone, explaining that I had been feeling disconnected from him and wondered if he was experiencing similar feelings. I gave him every opportunity to confess voluntarily, to show some remorse for what he had done, to demonstrate that he still had some respect for me and our marriage. This was his chance to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Instead, Mark doubled down on his deception. He claimed that work stress had been affecting his mood and behavior, apologized for being distant, and promised to make more effort to prioritize our relationship. The lies flowed so smoothly from his lips that I found myself almost admiring his skill as a manipulator, even as I was disgusted by his moral bankruptcy. His performance was polished and convincing, full of the right emotional notes and promises of changed behavior. If I had not witnessed his betrayal firsthand just hours earlier, I might have been fooled by his act. The realization of how many times he had probably used similar tactics to deflect my concerns over the past months was both enlightening and infuriating. I pressed him for specifics about his work commitments, asking detailed questions about the projects that were supposedly keeping him so busy. Mark answered confidently at first, but as I continued probing, his responses became more vague and contradictory. He was clearly making up details as he went along, and the inconsistencies in his story became more obvious with each question. When I asked about his plans for the previous evening, Mark claimed he had worked late and then slept at the office as he had texted me. He maintained eye contact while delivering this lie, apparently confident that I had no way of knowing the truth. The boldness of his deception while sitting just feet away from the bedroom where I had discovered him with another woman was breathtaking. This was the moment I had been building toward, the point where I would reveal that his carefully constructed lies had crumbled. I took a deep breath and told him quietly that I knew he had not been at the office the previous night. I informed him that I knew exactly where he had been and what he had been doing. The transformation in Mark's face was immediate and complete. The mask of innocent confusion fell away, replaced by a look of panic and calculation. He began stammering denials, but his body language had already betrayed him. The confident liar of moments before had been replaced by a cornered animal looking for escape routes. I continued speaking in the same measured tone, explaining that I had seen him in our bedroom with another woman. I described what I had witnessed in enough detail to make it clear that there could be no room for alternative explanations or continued denial. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mark's response revealed the true depth of his selfishness and lack of remorse. Instead of apologizing or showing concern for the pain he had caused me, his first instinct was to try to minimize the situation and shift blame. He claimed it was a one-time mistake brought on by stress and alcohol. He suggested that my own behavior had somehow contributed to his infidelity. The victim blaming was so outrageous that it actually helped me maintain my composure. Any lingering doubts I might have had about ending our marriage evaporated in the face of his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. This was not a man who was sorry for hurting me. This was someone who was sorry he had been caught. When his attempts at minimization failed to gain traction, Mark shifted to promises of change and pleas for forgiveness. He swore that the affair meant nothing to him, that I was the only woman he truly loved, that he would do whatever it took to rebuild my trust. The words might have been moving if they had not been delivered by someone who had just finished lying to my face with practiced ease. I let him exhaust himself with his desperate appeals before responding. When I finally spoke, it was to inform him that I had already contacted a divorce attorney and would be filing papers within the week. The finality of this statement seemed to shock him more than anything else I had said. He had apparently expected that his usual charm and manipulation would be enough to smooth over even this massive betrayal. Mark's reaction to my announcement of divorce proceedings revealed yet another layer of his true character. Instead of accepting responsibility or showing genuine remorse, he became angry and defensive. He accused me of being dramatic and unforgiving. He suggested that I was overreacting to what he characterized as a minor mistake that should not destroy 12 years of marriage. The gaslighting was so blatant that it would have been almost comical if it had not been so personally devastating. Here was a man who had systematically deceived me for months, brought another woman into our marital bed, and lied to my face just minutes earlier, now claiming that I was the one being unreasonable. The audacity was staggering. As Mark continued his desperate attempts to reframe the narrative in his favor, I realized that this conversation was serving an important purpose beyond just confronting him about his betrayal. It was showing me exactly who he really was, beneath the facade he had maintained throughout our marriage. The caring, devoted husband had been a carefully crafted persona, designed to serve his own interests. The man sitting across from me now, angry and defensive when caught in his deception, was the real Mark. This was the person I had unknowingly been married to for 12 years. The recognition was both liberating and heartbreaking. I was finally seeing clearly, but the clarity came at the cost of everything I had believed about my life and my relationship. When Mark realized that his anger was not having the desired effect, he switched tactics again, this time trying to appeal to my emotions and our shared history. He reminded me of special moments from our relationship, vacations we had taken together, challenges we had overcome as a team. He painted a picture of our marriage that bore little resemblance to the reality I had been living, especially over the past year. His selective memory and romanticized version of our relationship revealed another aspect of his manipulative nature. He was willing to rewrite history to serve his purposes, emphasizing positive moments while conveniently forgetting the distance, neglect, and deception that had characterized our recent interactions. The revisionist approach to our shared past was almost as insulting as the original betrayal. I remained calm throughout his emotional manipulation, partly because Rachel's coaching had prepared me for exactly these kinds of tactics, and partly because I felt emotionally detached from the man I was looking at. The person who could have hurt me with his words and promises was the husband I had believed existed. This stranger sitting at my kitchen table had no power over my emotions anymore. When Mark finally exhausted his repertoire of manipulation techniques and realized that I was not going to be swayed, he made one last desperate play. He offered to give up the other woman immediately, to attend marriage counseling, to do whatever it took to save our relationship. He painted a picture of redemption and renewal that might have been appealing to someone who still had faith in his capacity for change. But I had seen too much to believe in his ability to transform. The calculated nature of his betrayal, the ease with which he had lied to me for months, and his complete lack of genuine remorse told me everything I needed to know about his character. This was not a man who had made a mistake. This was someone who had made a series of deliberate choices that demonstrated his fundamental lack of respect for me and our marriage. My response to his final plea was simple and definitive. I told him that our marriage was over, that I would be consulting with attorneys about the best way to proceed with divorce, and that I expected him to move out of the house within the week. The clarity and finality of my statement seemed to shock him into silence for the first time since our conversation had begun. The look on Mark's face as the reality of his situation sank in was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. For the first time, he was facing real consequences for his actions. The comfortable life he had built on deception was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As I stood up from the kitchen table and prepared to leave him alone with the wreckage of our marriage, I felt a sense of power and self-determination that I had not experienced in years. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal in the darkness of her bedroom had emerged into the light as someone stronger and more self-aware than she had ever been before. The journey ahead would not be easy. Divorce proceedings, financial complications, and the emotional work of rebuilding my life would all present significant challenges. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, with my eyes wide open, making decisions based on truth rather than illusion. The intruder in my bed had not been a stranger after all, but rather the revelation of who my husband really was, beneath the mask he had worn throughout our marriage. In discovering his betrayal, I had also discovered my own strength and my ability to demand better for myself. The nightmare of that Tuesday night had become the beginning of my liberation from a relationship built on lies. As I walked out of the kitchen, leaving Mark alone with his coffee and his shattered excuses, I knew that I would never again be the naive, trusting woman who had gone to sleep peacefully in her marital bed, unaware of the deception happening right beside her. That woman was gone forever, replaced by someone who would never again settle for less than complete honesty and genuine respect in her relationships. The house that had been my prison of illusion was about to become the first stop on my journey toward a life built on truth, self-respect, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to thrive rather than merely survive. But Mark was not finished fighting for his comfortable lie. As I reached the kitchen doorway, he called out my name with a desperation I had never heard from him before. When I turned back, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen during our 12 years together. Genuine fear. Not fear of losing me, but fear of losing the lifestyle and security that our marriage had provided him. He stood up from the table so quickly that his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a sound that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. His movements were jerky and uncontrolled, revealing the panic that his words had tried to hide. This was not the composed, successful accountant that everyone in our social circle knew. This was a desperate man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Mark began speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other in a stream of consciousness that revealed more about his true priorities than any of his previous calculated responses. He talked about our house, our joint investments, the vacation property we had purchased in Michigan 2 years earlier. Everything he mentioned was financial, material, transactional. There was no mention of love, partnership, or emotional connection. The revelation was like a final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Our entire marriage had been a business arrangement for Mark, a convenient partnership that provided him with social respectability, financial stability, and domestic comfort, while leaving him free to pursue his real interests elsewhere. I had been an unwitting participant in a transaction, rather than a partner in a loving relationship. I let him continue his frantic monologue about assets and investments, while I observed him with the detached fascination of someone watching a stranger. The man I had thought I knew so well was revealing himself to be someone I had never really understood at all. Every assumption I had made about his character, his values, and his feelings for me had been based on a performance rather than reality. When Mark finally ran out of financial arguments and stood there breathing heavily in the middle of our kitchen, I realized that this moment represented more than just the end of our marriage. It was the death of the last remnants of the naive woman I had been before last night. The person who could have been hurt by his desperate pleas no longer existed. I told Mark calmly that his focus on money and assets only confirmed that I was making the right decision. A man who truly loved his wife would be devastated by the thought of losing her, not panicked about losing half of his investment portfolio. His priorities had been laid bare by his own words, and they painted a picture of someone incapable of the kind of love and commitment that marriage requires. Mark's response to this observation was to accuse me of being cold and calculating, of throwing away our marriage over one mistake. The irony of him calling me calculating while he had spent months systematically deceiving me was so profound that I almost laughed. He had no awareness of how his own behavior appeared to an objective observer, no recognition that his actions had consequences that extended beyond his own immediate desires. The gaslighting continued as Mark tried to reframe the entire situation as a mutual failure rather than a betrayal on his part. He suggested that we had both become complacent in our marriage, that we had both contributed to the distance that had developed between us. He painted a picture of shared responsibility that bore no resemblance to the reality of his calculated deception. I listened to his revisionist history with growing amazement at his ability to distort facts to serve his narrative. The months of lies, the systematic betrayal, the violation of bringing another woman into our bed, all of this was being repackaged as a relationship problem that we could solve together, if only I were willing to be reasonable and forgiving. The manipulation was so blatant and insulting that it actually strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Every word out of Mark's mouth confirmed that I was dealing with someone who was fundamentally dishonest, not just about his affair, but about the basic nature of reality itself. This was not a man who had made a mistake. This was someone whose entire approach to life was based on deception and self-interest. When I pointed out the inconsistencies in his story and the obvious attempts at manipulation, Mark's demeanor shifted once again. The desperate pleading gave way to cold anger, and for the first time in our conversation, I got a glimpse of what I suspected was his authentic personality beneath all the masks he wore. He accused me of being unforgiving and self-righteous, of holding him to impossible standards that no real person could meet. He suggested that my reaction was proof that I had never really loved him, that a truly loving wife would find a way to work through this challenge, rather than immediately seeking divorce. The projection was stunning in its audacity. This angry version of Mark was someone I had never seen before, but it felt more honest than any of his previous personas. The charming husband, the remorseful cheater, the desperate supplicant, all of these had been performances designed to achieve specific outcomes. This bitter, defensive man who blamed everyone but himself for his predicament was probably the closest thing to his true self that I had ever witnessed. I realized that this transformation was actually a gift, though not one that Mark had intended to give me. Seeing him without his masks made it impossible for me to romanticize our relationship or second-guess my decision to end it. The man standing in front of me was not someone I had ever really known, which meant that the marriage I thought I was losing had never actually existed in the first place. As Mark continued his angry tirade about my alleged shortcomings as a wife, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Gratitude. Not gratitude for the betrayal itself, but gratitude for the clarity it had provided. I had been living in a fog of confusion and self-doubt for months, wondering why I felt so disconnected from my own life. Now I understood that my instincts had been trying to warn me about something my conscious mind had refused to acknowledge. The emotional distance I had felt from Mark, the sense that something fundamental was missing from our relationship, the growing feeling that I was living someone else's life rather than my own, all of these had been accurate perceptions of a reality that I had been too trusting to recognize. My subconscious had been screaming warnings that my conscious mind had dismissed as paranoia or dissatisfaction. When Mark finally exhausted himself with his angry accusations and stood there glaring at me with undisguised hostility, I felt a sense of peace that I had not experienced in years. The uncertainty was over. The questions that had been plaguing me about the state of our marriage had been answered definitively. There was no ambiguity left to wrestle with, no room for second-guessing or self-doubt. I told Mark that our conversation had confirmed everything I needed to know about his character and our relationship, his inability to take responsibility for his actions, his attempts to manipulate and gaslight me, and his ultimate resort to anger and blame when his other tactics failed, had painted a complete picture of who he really was, beneath the facade he had maintained for so long. The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate his anger, and I watched as the reality of his situation began to sink in. For the first time since our conversation began, Mark appeared to understand that his usual methods of control and manipulation were not going to work. The comfortable life he had built on deception was truly coming to an end, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. As I turned to leave the kitchen for the final time as his wife, Mark made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. He threatened to make the divorce proceedings as difficult and expensive as possible, to fight me for every asset and every dollar. The threats revealed yet another layer of his true character. When he could not manipulate or charm his way out of consequences, he resorted to intimidation and cruelty. I paused in the doorway and looked back at him one final time. The man who had shared my bed, my home, and my life for 12 years was now threatening to destroy me financially because I refused to accept his betrayal. The transformation was complete. Any lingering affection or nostalgia I might have felt for our shared history evaporated in the face of his vindictive threats. My response was calm and measured, reflecting the strength I had discovered within myself over the past 24 hours. I informed Mark that I had already anticipated his threats and had taken steps to protect myself legally and financially. The divorce attorney I had consulted was experienced in dealing with hostile spouses who tried to use the legal system as a weapon. His threats would accomplish nothing except making the process more expensive for both of us. The shock on Mark's face when he realized that I had been several steps ahead of him throughout our entire conversation was almost worth the pain of discovering his betrayal. He had underestimated me completely, assuming that the trusting wife he had been deceiving would remain passive and controllable even after discovering his lies. He had failed to account for the possibility that betrayal might transform me into someone stronger and more strategic than he had ever imagined. As I walked up the stairs toward Rachel's room, leaving Mark alone with the wreckage of his carefully constructed deception, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The weight that had been pressing down on me for months, the confusion, the self-doubt, the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with my life, had been lifted completely. I finally understood what had been happening to me, and more importantly, I knew exactly what I needed to do about it. Rachel was waiting for me in her room, and the look on her face told me that she had heard enough of the conversation to understand how it had gone. She wrapped me in her arms, and for the second time in 24 hours, I found myself crying. But these tears were different from the ones I had shed the night before. They were not just tears of grief and betrayal, but also tears of relief and determination. The woman who had discovered an intruder in her bed had learned that the real intruder was not a stranger, but rather the revelation of who her husband had always been beneath his carefully constructed facade. In losing the marriage I thought I had gained something far more valuable, the truth about my life, and the strength to build something better on the foundation of that truth. The journey ahead would be challenging, but I was ready for it. I had survived the worst night of my life and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to create a future based on honesty, self-respect, and genuine connection, rather than comfortable lies and convenient arrangements.